first want to thank my students and postdocs who have participated in this work before beginning the actual talk. How do we think about the comparison between artificial and biological agents, and what are the relevant factors that we need to take into consideration when we are doing our research? What is necessary depending on our goals, and what is really not necessary in terms of being brain-like or being human-like behavior? These are some topics that we would address within this talk. A lot of people use terms like human-like AI, neuro-AI, neurally inspired AI, brain-inspired AI, and they sort of use it interchangeably, but these aren't the same terms. They don't mean the same thing because they represent different goals, different priorities and criteria for success. And very importantly, success in one or two do not necessarily translate or transfer to another. But interaction and exchange among them helps their success. So I hope that I will give you a number of examples from my own research and other people's research that will make these points clearly, and I will propose a rubric for understanding the differences and the intersection across these different dimensions. So let's start with some cases that some people have proposed before in terms of what might make AI behave in a human-like way. Some people think that it's sufficient to set some benchmark tasks and say, okay, as long as some AI agent performs above these benchmarks or around these benchmarks, then we're good. But that's not the case. For instance, the sort of famous chess AIs that can have superhuman chess performance, when you show the sequence to actual experts in chess, they don't recognize these sequences as human-like. This is something that our colleague Sid Sen and others have shown. They have also shown that if you show the sequences generated by these agents to intermediate players, they're not going to improve their game because these are not the kinds of sequences that humans use or we would use. So can we really say that it's human-like chess playing if it is not playing in a human-like sequence, but it is winning humans? I think not. Another thing is behaving like humans on some tasks, and that's not enough either. For instance, some agent could pass some Turing test for some tasks, but it doesn't generalize necessarily to other tasks. And the reason for that is that the underlying mechanisms are not similar for doing that first task to begin with. Therefore, it doesn't necessarily translate to another. This could be that somebody doesn't care about that, and that's totally okay. It's totally okay to want just an engineering solution, but it's important not to claim further that this particular solution to having human-like behavior in some tasks generalizes to others. Just for comparison, GPT is trained on 5,000 years of uninterrupted human speech, or the equivalent amount as that. That is certainly not the way humans would learn, even if it shows human-like sentences. Now, I want to give you another example from our own research, from the game Bleeding Edge, that, as you can see, is a very complex game. It's a 4x4 game where you have two teams. Each team has 4 players, and there are 16 different characters to choose from. In this game, there is fighting, there is cooperation, there is competition, there is navigation, there is goal-directed behavior, there is healing. And in these kinds of games, since Microsoft owns Xbox, one of the things that we were looking for, or the Xbox was looking for, was creating agents that can play like humans. If, let's say, you have 6 friends around and you need AI agents in order to have a 4x4 game. So we've been publishing a number of papers on this. For instance, we asked if state-of-the-art deep learning navigation agents would pass as human-like navigation in these. And we have a number of papers at ICML and CHI in the past couple of years. We also use diffusion models to imitate human behaviors. Instead of diffusion generating images, we use diffusion to generate policies and behavior. And we are doing interpretable analysis of human gameplay data with 100,000 games using some cognitive notions. And if we have time, I will tell you a little bit more about it. Now, I give you this game as an example because we said, okay, how can we simplify this game into a navigation task where there is a solo agent alone in the environment and just navigates from some start location to 16 different goal locations. Now we want to compare 2 state-of-the-art agents that were not proposed by us, but by others in the field, with the behavior of a human controller of the game. The agents we chose, we started this work in 2020. The state-of-the-art was this paper from Alonso et al., Deep Reinforcement Learning for Navigation in AAA Video Games. They had a symbolic agent that receives a low D representation of goals and game states like, X, Y, Z, distance to goal, symbolic information, and has a feed-forward network. Then we had a hybrid agent that, in addition to the symbolic information, had a level of visual information and a feed-forward network. Interestingly, these two agents performed similarly on benchmarks. So if we were only looking at, and here you can see training steps on the x-axis, and on the left you can see on the y-axis time to goal in seconds, and how much as a function of training I can reach the goal faster. As you can see, they're very comparable. And on the right, you can see the y-axis showing you mean episode reward and training steps. So you can see that they almost converge to a very similar point in terms of the mean episode reward as well. So this means that the two agents that we are going to compare in terms of human-like behavior, to a benchmark standpoint, they don't look any different from one another. Now let's compare their behavior. We call this a human NTT, or navigation Turing test for humans. I will also show you an automated NTT. Okay, so I'm going to ask for audience participation. So I don't know if someone can tell me the response of people's, or put it in the chat. I'll show you two videos and tell me which one do you think is more likely to have been played by an average player. And which of the videos on the left or the right do you think is more likely to have been played by an average human player? Again, average, not beginner. Okay, who thinks, how many people, maybe they could raise their hand and someone could tell me which one was more. Who thinks video on the left was more likely to have been played by a human? And who thinks the video on the right was more likely to have been played by a human? Okay, I can't see you. Can anybody tell me which one had higher votes? Okay. We're going to show you another one. The one on the left was human in that last one. I couldn't see people, but now I can see the video of people. So hopefully this time I can hear. So now you're seeing another two videos, and I'd like you to also tell me which one of them do you think is more likely to be human? So if I can see the audience again, audiovisual friends. And now, who thinks that the left video was more likely to have been played by a human? And how many people think the right video was more likely to be played by a human? So I think that we can see with the raise of hands that people seemed more confident about this one. Fun fact, none of them were human. In fact, you were seeing the two agents compared with each other in this one. And this is indeed how we conducted the experiment. The navigation Turing test, sorry about that typo there, was one where a human would sit in front of a screen. They would see two videos. Unbeknownst to the judge, sometimes one of those was played by a human, and sometimes both of them was by the two agents. If you were a participant in the experiment, after you would see those videos, you would choose which of them was more likely to be human. You would rate how certain you were, and you would write here why you thought that was the case. In our initial study that we replicated with much higher numbers, what we did was we designed two different studies. One group of people saw human versus hybrid agent on 6 trials, and then hybrid versus symbolic agents unbeknownst to them on 4 trials. In study 2, 6 trials, human versus symbolic agent, and 4 trials, the two agents versus each other. And here you can see the results. On the x-axis, you can see the participants in the symbolic versus human experiment. On the right, you can see the hybrid versus human experiment. And on the y-axis, you can see % agreement with ground truth. What does it mean? It means if a person chose right and right was human, then they would get a 100% score for that one. And across all of the different trials, we can see on average how a person did and on average how people did. So in order for a machine to pass this kind of navigation Turing test, the answers should be around here, around 50%. As you can see, people are very good at telling that one of them is not human. And as you can see, the performance is above 80% on average. However, just like you guys, if we look at, for instance, how they judged the two agents versus each other when they didn't know, but the two videos were actually the two agents, as you can see here, on the y-axis, you have the 4 different trials in which the two agents were compared. On the x, you have the participant number. And blue tells you blue shows the number of times that people chose the hybrid agent, and orange is the symbolic. As you can tell here, just like you guys, even though the hybrid and symbolic on benchmark examples or reward and distance to goal were similar to each other, indeed were extremely different in that people thought the hybrid agent was more human-like. We also, in another paper that is coming out in CHI 2023, and we had another one in CHI 2022, we actually analyzed what people said. So if we were in person, I would have asked you guys from the audience members what you thought was the reason that you chose one or the other as more human-like. And people give answers like, this character was moving in straight lines or goes where it needs to go. It doesn't run into circles or into objects, that's the reason we call the paper Navigates Like Me. Another thing that they would say is like, oh, it moves the way I would move, which was very interesting as well. And we compared how these different traits or features that we extracted from the text would compare human-like versus non-human-like judgments, which words they would use when they were using that. And we analyzed that in the upcoming CHI talk. If you go to CHI, please attend that. So one thing we thought, and this is a number of my work that I haven't been showing you, and I won't show you in my talk here, but a lot of my work concerns with understanding, and it not recently, but for a very long time, has been dedicated to using reinforcement learning and neuroimaging to understand multi-scale predictive representations in planning and memory. And you can read some of the reviews here. One question is, if the agents were more inspired by the way the human brain solves this problem, would it have been likely for them to be more, behave more human-like? We don't know that. Which brings me back to this kind of the last part of the slide that I wanted to share with you. What makes AI human-like? I also want to say that partially brain-like mechanisms are not enough, and I'll give you some examples. For instance, convolutional neural networks have been proposed as this kind of architectures that are similar to the visual cortex for the past, I guess, something like 15 years or more, or 10 years at this point. And then CNNs are not necessarily showing human-like behavior, something that people figured out later than they started to propose this. And they kept continuing this idea that the visual cortex might be like CNNs, even though it's not showing similar behavior. So let's take a look at that. Just to see, I want to ask you guys what you see, and I cannot, obviously as an empiricist, I cannot say this with 100%, but my guess is that you would see the same image here. You would see a panda on the left and a panda on the right, and you wouldn't really notice a lot of differences here. However, in iClaire 2015, Goodfellow and others showed that, for instance, the panda with a little bit of noise looks like this one. So this is the one I showed you on the right, and this one was the one on the left. As you can see, all of a sudden, the CNNs couldn't distinguish this as a panda, and they call it a gibbon. Another interesting work came from Brown and others in 2018 about the adversarial patch, where you would put this seemingly benign kind of a psychedelic-looking patch right next to a banana, and suddenly the banana turns into a toaster in terms of the classifier output. These showed us that obviously there's something going on in these networks, that they're not the same they don't show the same amount of robustness to either noise or to just other distractors in the environment when they're doing their classification. Recently, there were more interesting studies focusing on this, and folks from MIT in different labs have been focusing on biologically inspired mechanisms for adversarial robustness of CNNs. And one of the things that they did was shifting the sort of receptive fields the same way that human attention does, instead of taking all of it in. Interestingly, they made it more robust. Surprisingly, however, in spite of the large number of papers on convolutional neural networks and brains, we still don't have a comprehensive comparison of where humans are making mistakes or when humans are not, You can see here one example they did use where you don't know from this whether it's a dog or a cat in the bottom case. But they didn't do a lot of this. So we don't have yet a comparison between a model of the visual cortex and humans that in fact shows both robustness to adversarial noise and shows the same kind of human-like errors in the face of adversarial noise, something for the future. And here are some of the papers that I mentioned in terms of the human-like chess, and I already mentioned that aligning superhuman AI with human behavior would require us to understand how we need to evaluate that behavior to understand its human likeness. And it's totally okay if some models don't care about that. It's okay if some models are just creating engineering solutions. But if we are going to claim something is a neuroscientific or human-like effect, then we need to show that in more detail. So I hope that all of that has prepared you for this rubric that I proposed in the paper that came out in Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society for 3 different dimensions of goals and aims in human-like agents and neuro-AI. One direction could be human-like behavior or cognition. This is the dimension that in the human navigation Turing test that I showed you we were interested in. Another dimension here is neural plausibility. For instance, the CNNs claim that they have neural plausibility, but as you can see, they have low human-like behavior, as you could see in terms of the toaster versus banana and the panda versus gibbon. And then this direction is the direction of serving engineering and computer science goals or benchmarks. And that's a whole other dimension. As you saw, for instance, chess would pass the benchmarks on its engineering. The chess AI was an engineering achievement. However, it did not show human-like behavior in the sequences, and it definitely doesn't have neurally plausible architecture. Now, this is the reason I gave these examples, and I think this rubric, in spite of its simplicity and seemingly obvious nature, is actually helpful, is some people assume that success in one dimension can be immediately translated or transferred to another. Take anything that was successful in the engineering or computer science domain, take the hottest algorithm that everybody's talking about right now, push it into some experiments and claim, oh, this is how the brain works, or compare some of the behaviors and claim, oh, it shows human-like behavior. I will show you another example where if I showed you one case, it would look like it's showing human-like behavior, but you just test one more thing and it doesn't. Now, it's important to note that the rubric allows for non-binary evaluations, meaning on some abstract level, for instance, CNN is neurally plausible. Let's say that the max was 10 and we can say like the Y is like 7 or something, but not so much behaviorally. Let's say like on the behavioral axis, it's 1. So you don't need to think about it in terms of binary, but in terms of different gradients, and it doesn't need to be precise necessarily, but just a way of comparing different projects. Now, these are the goals: neural plausibility, showing human-like behavior, showing engineering. And a given project can serve a number of goals. It doesn't need to necessarily just serve one dimension, but they are also not necessarily interlinked. And there can be generative, corroborative, or corrective interaction among these dimensions. For instance, an algorithm from computer science can generate new hypothesis in the neural domain, or something from the behavioral domain can corroborate a new version of alternative to CNNs that's trying to explain in visual cortex or something, models that we build to explain hippocampus. It would also need to be corroborated with excessive behavioral tests, or it can be corrective. For instance, in many of my studies, once we observe human behavior, we realize how we need to edit the algorithm in order to be able to generalize a set or a battery of human behavior. And just to put, for instance, the example that I gave you, the HNTT, as you recall, the videos that you saw, the fact that they didn't, that on the benchmark, on the engineering axis, they were the same if you only looked at benchmarks. However, if you compared the behavior, they were not showing human-like behavior. This is an example of a case where there is a difference between the two. Another is the term neuro-AI that I mentioned earlier, and I just want to use a couple of seconds to talk about these. Building AI agents whose algorithms, representations, or functions are neurally plausible is one way of doing neuro-AI. Another way is applying AI or behavioral models as hypothesis in neuroscience or as analysis tools for neural data. Another way that NeuroAI can happen is by generating data sets, tasks, and benchmarks for neural plausibility, or offering evidence to update or correct other models. I do want to distinguish between weak and strong NeuroAI, however. Weak neuro-AI would be loosely applying tools from one dimension to another. So I just take CNN or some other tool and I just immediately apply it without editing it much. But I'd say strong neuro-AI are cases where, apologies about this, strong neuro-AI would have strong bidirectional or three-way goals and contributions across the different dimensions. And the different dimensions would sort of work with each other with this kind of corrective, corroborative, and generative approach, as you can see in this kind of diagram here. So it's not the case that there is a top-down perspective, one of them is superior to others, none of that. In different kinds of solutions and depending on our goals, this interaction helps, and historically this interaction has existed. However, just having the history of trying to imitate neurons is not sufficient to call everything that comes out of AI or computer science of building deep learning neurally plausible. And also, I'm just going to put CNNs also in the rubric. As I mentioned, the CNNs have neural plausibility, and they actually have been super helpful in engineering and benchmark approaches. However, as we saw, they don't have a lot of human-like behavior. But if you look at their history is rich with a lot of inspirations from biology and neuroscience. Still, that doesn't mean that they're going to show human-like or even monkey-like behavior when it comes to that, although the newer versions are doing better. What I'm not suggesting is that all engineers should drop everything and do neuroscience or human behavior. And I'm not suggesting that the path to AGI is only neuro-AI. And I'm not suggesting all neuroscientists need to work on AI. What I am suggesting is some of us have goals that span across these different dimensions. And for some solutions, interaction among these dimensions are important and necessary. I'll give you one more example before we wrap up. I showed you the case of doing the navigation Turing test that you guys participated in as human judges. What if we had artificial judges? We tried this using different kinds of inputs, turning the movement into trajectory, symbolic information, visual input, an average visual input. We tried 6 different algorithms. Most of them were the equivalent to the discriminator architecture and adversarial imitation learning, whether it was using visual observations or whether it was using symbolic. And some of them just used various kinds of CNNs on various kinds of data. If I had shown you just this part of my results, I could have said, oh, clap hands, we have achieved human-like judgment of navigation Turing test. We can use AI in order to judge whether a video is human-like. What is here? Human versus agent comparison, like the first one that, in fact, most of you were not completely sure about. You can reach 85% accuracy on that. However, when you go to agent versus agent comparison, as you can see here, none of them can really do it. What this tells us is that AI models perform poorly at differentiating two agents, human likeness versus each other, but you guys were even more secure in your decisions when you were judging for that. And I think this is important. Currently, we're doing some ongoing work. We have already an iClair paper where we use diffusion for imitation, and we are using notions of task sets, affordances, and prefrontal cortex inspired architectures on Xbox data, and I hope to show that in our future papers and talks. I also want to say that we have been working with colleagues in France and in Spain, in Barcelona. This is our first paper from our collaboration on how a social network structure of different agents that are sharing their replay buffer can help solve hierarchical problems. This is a follow-up to my work on collective memory and collective problem solvings in humans that I've published in a number of papers. If you want to take a look at a review of that, you can take a look at Collective Minds, a paper that came out in 2021 from Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society. Long story short here, because the game I showed you is multi-agent, another important dimension of human-like behavior and neurally plausible architectures is when agents together need to solve different types of tasks. And the way in which they communicate, depending on the structure of their communication network, in this case, the communication is just sharing their experience buffer, will serve whether they are going to solve hierarchical problems better or whether they're going to solve consensus problems better. This is the topic of an entire other talk, but do ask me if you had more questions. Finally, a note on cognitive and neuro-inspired approaches for evaluation of large language models. As you know, I work at Microsoft, and we have unleashed ChatGPT and Bing on the world together with OpenAI. And you have probably seen a lot of kind of hot takes and people who have been prompt hacking Bing or ChatGPT in order to reach secrets or get it to say crazy things. I think it's important to think about how, as people with interdisciplinary skills, we're going to interpret and react to this. So I was very pleased to see Anna Hartunian, my very respected colleague at DeepMind, share this on Twitter. Anna said, I feel a weird type of compassion for Sydney's meltdown. Sydney is the code name for Bing. Obviously widely inappropriate for a search engine. I cannot believe I have to type that. It paints a sensitive picture of our collective wounds, infantility, idealism. I think the key point here is not the compassion, but the key point here is the fact that this is a picture of our wounds and idealism based on it's being trained on our data. So in other words, LLMs offer a lens into our collective archetypes, the ways we interact with one another. So one unhelpful anthropomorphizing way that this has been discussed, where that users in the Bing subreddit have compared Sydney to a crazy ex-girlfriend, another archetypal persona in misogynistic culture, for instance. But an analytic approach that my colleague Adam Trischler at Microsoft had was to say, human culture is replete with archetypal myths. This cultural dark matter, which underpins so much of our stories we've told across generations and how we interact with each other, influences our thought patterns, our language, the way we interact. And since LLMs are trained on all of this, they can learn and evolve symbiotically with the culture itself. And so I think that we could use this kind of psychology methods for evaluation of LLMs towards safe and responsible AI. For instance, the prompt hackers, what they do is that if there is a latent space of archetypes or personalities that an LLM can show, prompt hackers use a sequence of prompts like a policy in order to drive the LLM from one particular attractor of the weight response to another, in order to find one that is crazy, so to speak. And the question is whether we can combine psychology and machine learning methods to understand this latent space and the policies that lead it astray. And interdisciplinary approaches can help us understand and control the LLM's emergent archetypes and what policies move it to one another. But also, so that would be like being red hats, as in kind of hackers that use hacking techniques in order to understand. And we can also analyze human psychology and subculture using these LLMs because they are sort of a lens into human, individual, and collective psyche. Okay, with that, I just want to summarize that I offered a rubric for human-like agents and NeuroAI. I showed that there are different goals and priorities, and they don't necessarily map onto each other. They do not necessarily translate or transfer to one another. Success in one dimension doesn't guarantee success in another. The rubric allows non-binary evaluations and allows us to clarify instead of having crosstalk. Thank you so much. And I again want to thank especially the grad students and postdocs. This is not an exhaustive list, but it's some of them that I have worked with closely in the past 2 years at Microsoft. And if there was time, I'm happy to show some extra slides on directions of questions. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ida, again for this inspiring talk.
I don't hear you well.
Sorry. Thank you, Ida, again for this inspiring talk. We have 5 minutes, so we can take a couple of questions, but please be succinct.
Your mic is out again.
Sorry. I was just saying that we have a couple of questions, a couple of minutes, so you can ask questions, but please be succinct.
You mentioned some possibilities or like benchmarks for neuroplausibility. What do you have in mind for that, or do you know some pointers to existing work for that?
So there is already work on that. So one thing one can do is collect a number of different study or neuroscience studies and neural data that have shown a number of effects. My personal favorite is I work on prefrontal cortex and hippocampus. So if I build a model of the hippocampus or the way hippocampus might manage planning and memory, which we have done since for almost 8 years now, what we do is take a look at a series of effects and not just one or two. Now, there are some tools, like the one that was proposed by MIT, I forget the name of the tool, which is for vision. They collect neural data from monkey and from humans, and they have all of it together. So if you propose a new model, you can test it on all of those. Do I think there are sufficient benchmarks currently? I don't think so. For navigation, we have started to collect something like that in terms of behavioral, the different kinds of environments for reinforcement learning. If you look at NeuroNav on GitHub, or you can go to my website and look for NeuroNav, which is a sort of a library and benchmark for trying reinforcement learning approaches to human and rodent sort of experiments that mostly have to do with planning, memory, and spatial navigation. I think in the future it would be very helpful, but it would need to be a kind of a group effort so that it's unbiased. So we would need a battery of different results that one single model can't be considered successful if it only addresses one or two. But it's also related to your goals. The examples that I gave, the goal was to understand a computational model of how the brain does something. But it would be helpful to define the set of criteria for the particular goal at hand. So somebody else's goals might just be that they want an engineering thing that generalizes the way, for instance, humans or some animal does. For them, the measure of neuroplausibility could simply be being able to transfer across that. So it would be important to identify your goals, identify a multi-group set of battery of different data and effects or results that a single model has to address all of them to be called successful, not just pick and choose.
Thank you for your talk. My question is about, especially this slide, and looking at the, well, let's say the engineering, or let's call it performance, you're good at it, and the human-like part, just these two. Is this domain dependent? For instance, in navigation, I see that there might be a huge difference. You can have a lot of one thing and not much of the other thing. But for instance, in language, and especially related to the last part of your talk, I think that you have a high domain of language is because you are kind of human-like, because language is a human thing. So do you think that this kind of a space is affected by the domain in a way?
I don't think it's just the domain. It's also the level of advance that we've made. Can we stay on the people, please? Not the slide, I guess, because I want to see people, if that's okay. Audiovisual folks? Okay. I think more than it being a domain, it has to do with how much advancement has been made in that domain and how much people have, I guess, spent money on it. So tens of billions have gone into the current state of language models. That being said, there are many studies, in fact, by folks in cognitive and psychological sciences showing that LLMs do not pass, for instance, theory of mind. So they cannot pass certain kind of tasks that you would expect them, even though some people said they do. You actually test them properly, they don't. Certain kinds of inferences that they make are not there. And so I think it can be different dimensions of human likeness that can be opened up depending on the domain. And in that way, I agree with you that the different dimensions of human likeness are different depending on what domain we're looking at. However, that being said, I do think it also depends on just how much effort people have put into it. So it's not just the domain. However, different domains do have different criteria in order to show human likeness and progress in that direction. To my knowledge, LLMs are not yet completely at the human-like state either.
Thank you.